Hi and welcome to the Lambda Audiobooks channel. You are listening to the audiobook, The Return by Walter de Mare. This chapter is titled Chapter 11. Beginning chapter. Lawford slept far into the cloudy Monday morning, to wake steeped in sleep, lethargic, and fretfully haunted by inconclusive remembrances of the night before. When Sheila, with obvious and capacious composure, brought him his breakfast tray, he watched her face for some time without speaking. Sheila, he began, as she was about to leave the room again. She posed, smiling. Did anything happen last night? Would you mind telling me, Sheila? Who was here? Her lids the least bit narrowed. Certainly, Arthur. Mr. Danton was here. Then it was not a dream. Oh no, said Sheila. What did I say? What did he say? It was hopeless, anyhow. I don't quite understand what you mean by hopeless, Arthur. And must I answer the other questions? Lawford drew his hand over his face, like a tired child. He didn't believe me. No, dear, said Sheila softly. And you, Sheila, came the subdued voice. Sheila crossed slowly to the window. Well, quite honestly, Arthur, I was not very much surprised. Whatever we are agreed about on the whole, you were scarcely yourself last night. Lawford shut his eyes and reopened them full on his wife's calm scrutiny, who had in that moment turned in the light of the one drawn blind to face him again. Who is? Always. No, said Sheila, but it was at least unfortunate. We can't, I suppose, rely on dear Bethany alone. Lawford crouched over his food. Will he blab? He blab. Mr. Danton is a gentleman, Arthur. Lawford rolled his eyes as in temporary vertigo. Yes, he said. And Sheila once more prepared to make a reposeful exit. I don't think I can see Simon this morning. Oh. Who, then? I mean, I would prefer to be left alone. Believe me, I had no intention to intrude. And this time the door really closed. He is in a quiet, soothing sleep, said Sheila a few minutes later. Nothing could be better, said Sir Simon, and Lawford, to his inexpressible relief, heard the fevered throbbing of the doctor's car reverse, and turned over and shut his eyes, dulled and exhausted in the still unfriendliness of the vacant room. His spirits had sunk, he thought, to their lowest ebb. He scarcely heeded the fragments of dreams, clear, green landscapes, amazing gleams of peace, the sudden broken voices, the rustling and calling shadowiness of subconsciousness, in this quiet sunlight of reality. The clouds had broken, or had been withdrawn like a veil from the October skies. One thought alone was his refuge, one face alone haunted him with its peace, One remembrance soothed him, Alice. Through all his scattered and purposeless arguments, he strove to remember her voice, the loving kindness of her eyes, her untroubled confidence. In the afternoon, he got up and dressed himself. He could not bring himself to stand before the glass and deliberately shave. He even smiled at the thought of playing the barber to that lean chin. He dressed by the fireplace. I couldn't rest, but he told Sheila when she presently came in on one of her quiet, cautious, heedful visits, and one tires of reading even Quain in bed. "Have you found anything?" she inquired politely. "Oh, yes," said Lawford wearily. "I have discovered that infinitely worse things are infinitely commoner, but that there's nothing quite so picturesque." "Tell me," said Sheila, with refreshing naivete. "How does it feel? Does it even in the slightest degree affect your mind?" He turned his back and looked up at his broad gilt portrait for inspiration. "Practically not at all," he said hollowly. "Of course, one's nerves, that fellow Danton, when one's overtired." "You have," his voice, in spite of every effort, faintly quavered, you haven't noticed anything." "My mind." "Me." "Oh dear, no. I never was the least bit observant. You know that, Arthur. But apart from that, and I hope you will not think me unsympathetic, but don't you think we must sooner or later be thinking of what's to be done? At present, though I fully agree with Mr. Bethany as to the wisdom of hushing this unhappy business up as long as possible, at least from the gossiping outside world, still we are only standing still. And your malady, dear, I suppose, isn't it? You will help me, Arthur. You will try and think. Poor Alice." "What about Alice?" "She mopes, dear, rather. She cannot, of course, quite understand why she must not see her father, and yet his not being, or, for the matter of that, even if he was, at death's door." "At death's door," murmured Lawford under his breath. Who was it was saying that? "Have you ever, Sheila, in a dream, or just as one's thoughts go sometimes, seen that door? Its ruinous stone lintel carved into lichenous stone heads, stonily silent in the last thin sunlight, hanging in peace unlatched, heated, hunted, in agony, in that cold, green-clad, shedded porch's haven and sanctuary, a god beyond a." Sheila stood listening with startled eyes. "And was all that in Quain?" she inquired rather flutteringly. Lawford turned a sidelong head and looked steadily at his wife. She shook herself with a slight shiver. "Very well, then," she said, and posed in the silence. Her husband yawned and smiled, and almost as if lit with that thin last sunshine seemed the smile that passed for an instant across the reverie of his shadowy face. He drew a hand warily over his eyes. "What has he been saying now?" he inquired like a fretful child. Sheila stood very quiet and still, as if in fear of scaring some rare, wild, timid creature by the least stir. She merely breathed. Lawford posed on the hearth-rug with his comb in his hand. "It's just the last rags of that beastly influenza," he said, and began vigorously combing his hair. And yet, simple and frank though the action was, it moved Sheila, perhaps, more than any other of the congested occurrences of the last few days. Her forehead grew suddenly cold. The palms of her hands began to ache. She had to hasten out of the room to avoid revealing the sheer physical repulsion she had experienced. But Lawford, quite unmindful of the shock, continued in a kind of heedless reverie to watch, as he calmed, the still visionary thoughts that passed in tranced stillness before his eyes. He longed beyond measure for freedom that, until yesterday, he had not even dreamed existed outside the covers of some old impossible romance. The magic of the darkening sky, the invisible flocking presences of the dead, the shock of imaginations that had no words, of quixotic emotions which the stranger had stirred in that low, mocking, furtive talk beside the broken stones of the Huguenot. Was the change quite so monstrous, so meaningless? How often, indeed, he remembered curiously had he seemed to be standing outside these fast-shut gates of thought that now had been freely opened to him. He drew ajar the door and leaned his ear to listen. From far away came a rich, long-continued chuckle of laughter, followed by the clatter of a falling plate, and then still more uncontrollable laughter. There was a faint smell of toast on the air. Lawford ventured out onto the landing and into a little room that had once, in years gone by, been Alice's nursery. He stood far back from the strip of open window that showed beneath the green blind, craning forward to see into the garden, the trees, their knotted trunks, and then, as he stole nearer, a flower bed, late roses, geraniums, calceolarias, the lawn, and, yes, 3 wicker chairs, a footstool, a work-basket, a little table on the smooth grass in the huni-colored sunshine, and Sheila sitting there in the autumnal sunlight, her hands resting on the arms of her chair, her head bent, evidently deeply engrossed in her thoughts. He crept an inch or two forward and stooped. There was a hat on the grass, Alice's big garden hat, and beside it lay Flitters, nose on paws, long ears sagging. He had forgotten Flitters. Had Flitters forgotten him? Would he bark at the strange, distasteful scent of A. der Ferguson? The coast was clear, then. He turned even softlier yet, to confront, rapt, still, and hovering betwixt astonishment and dread, the blue calm eyes of his daughter, looking in at the door. It seemed to Lawford as if they had both been suddenly swept by some unseen power into a still, unearthly silence. "We thought," he began at last, "we thought just to beckon Mrs. Lawford from the window. He is asleep." Alice nodded. Her whole face was in a moment floated with red. It ebbed and left her pale. "I will go down and tell mother you want to see her. It was very silly of me. I did not quite recognize at first, thinking of my father." The words faltered, and the eyes were lifted to his face again with a desolate, incredulous appeal. Lawford turned away heartsick and trembling. Certainly, by no means," he began, listening vaguely to the glad patter that seemed to come from another mouth. "Your father, my dear young lady, I venture to think, is now really on the road to recovery. Der Simon makes excellent progress. But, of course, 2 heads, we know, are so much better than one when there's the least difficulty. The great thing is quiet. Rest, isolation, no possibility of a shock. Else, his voice fell away, his eloquence failed. For Alice stood gazing stirlessly on and on into this infinitely strange, infinitely familiar, shadowy, phantasmal face. "Oh, yes," she replied, "I quite understand. Of course, but if I might just peep even, it would. I should be so much, much happier. Do let me just see him, dear Ferguson, if only his head on the pillow. I wouldn't even breathe. Couldn't it possibly help? Even a faith cure?" She leaned forward impulsively, her voice trembling, and her eyes still shining beneath their faint, melancholy smile. "I fear, my dear, it cannot be. He longs to see you, but with his mind, you know, in this state, it might be." "But mother never told me," broke in the girl desperately, "there was anything wrong with his mind." "Oh, but that was quite unfair. You don't mean that, eh?" Lawford scanned swiftly the little square beloved and memoried room that fate had suddenly converted for him into a cage of unspeakable pain and longing. "Oh, no, believe me, no. Not his brain, not that, not even wandering, really, but always thinking, always longing on and on for you, dear, only quite master of himself. But you talk," she broke in again angrily, "only in pretense. You're treating me like a child, and so does mother, and so it has been ever since I came home. Why? 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 If mother can, and you can, why may not I? Why? 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 If he can walk and talk in the night, eh? But who can walk and talk in the night? Inquired a low, stealthy voice out of the quietness behind her. Alice turned swiftly. Her mother was standing at a little distance, with all the calm and moveless concentration of a waxwork figure, looking up at her from the staircase. I was talking to der Ferguson, mother. But as I came up the stairs, I understood you to be inquiring something of der Ferguson. If you were saying he can walk and talk in the night, you surely were not referring to your father, child. That could not possibly be, in his state. Der Ferguson, I know, will bear me out in that at least. And besides, I really must insist on following out medical directions to the letter. Der Ferguson, I know, will fully concur. Do, pray, der Ferguson, continued Sheila, raising her voice even now scarcely of a rapid murmur. Do pray assure my daughter that she must have patience, that however much even he himself may desire it, it is impossible that she should see her father yet. And now, my dear child, come down. I want to have a moment's talk with der Ferguson. I feared from his beckoning at the window that something was amiss. Alice turned, dismayed, and looked steadily, almost with hostility, at the stranger, so curiously transfixed and isolated in her small old playroom. And in this scornful yet pleading confrontation her eye fell suddenly on the pin in his scarf, the claw, and the pearl she had known all her life. From that her gaze flitted, like some wild, demented things, over face, hair, hands, clothes, attitude, expression, and her heart stood still in an awful, inarticulate dread of the unknown. She turned slowly towards her mother, groped forward a few steps, turned once more, stretching out her hands towards the vague still figure whose eyes had called so piteously to her out of their depths, and fell fainting in the doorway. Lawford stood motionless, vacantly watching Sheila, who knelt, chafing the cold hands. "She has fainted," he said. "Oh, Sheila, tell me, only fainted, eh?" Sheila made no answer, did not even raise her eyes. "Some day, Sheila," he began in a dull voice, and broke off, and without another word, without even another glance at the still face and blue, twitching lids, he passed her rapidly by, and in another instant Sheila heard the house door shut. She got up quickly, and after a glance into the vacant bedroom turned the key. Then she hastened upstairs for sal volatile and eau de cologne. It was yet clear daylight when Lawford appeared beneath the portico of his house. With a glance of circumspection that almost seemed to suggest a fear of pursuit, he descended the steps, only to be made aware in so doing that Ada was with a kind of furtive eagerness pointing out the mysterious Der Furtison to a steadily gazing cook. One or two well-known and many a well-remembered face he encountered in the thin stream of city, men treading blackly along the pavement. It was a still, high evening, and something very like a forlorn compassion rose in his mind at sight of their grave, rather pretentious, rather dull, respectable faces. He found himself walking with an affectation of effrontery, and smiling with a faint contempt on all alike, as if to keep himself from slinking, and the wolf out of his eyes. He felt restless, and watchful, and suspicious, as if he had suddenly come down in the world. His, then, was a disguise as effectual as a shabby coat and a glazing eye. His heart sickened. Was it even worth while living on a crust of social respectability so thin and so exquisitely treacherous? He challenged no one. One or two actual acquaintances raised and lowered a faintly inquiring eyebrow in his direction. One even recalled in his confusion a smile of recognition just a moment too late. There was, it seemed, a peculiar aura in Lawford's presence, a shadow of a something in his demeanor that proved him alien. None the less Green Widderstone kept calling him, much as a bell in the imagination tolls on and on, the echo of reality. If the worst should come to the worst, why? There is pasture in the solitary byways for the beast that strays. He quickened his pace along Lonelier streets, and soon strode freely through the little flagged and cobbled village of shops, past the same small jutting window whose clock had told him the hour on that first, dark hurried night. All was pale and faint with dying colors now, and decay was in the leaf, and the last swallows filled the gold air with their clashing stillness. No one heeded him here. He looked from side to side, exulting in the strangeness. Shops were left behind, the last milestone passed, and in a little while he was descending the hill beneath the elm boughs, which he remembered had stood like a turreted wall against the sunset when first he had wandered down into the churchyard. At the foot of the hill he passed by the green and white rectory, and there was the parson, a short, fat, pursy man with wrists protruding from his jacket sleeves as he stood on tiptoe tying up a rambling rose shoot on his trimmed cedared lawn. The next house barely showed its old red chimney tops above its bowers. The next was empty, with windows vacantly gazing, its paths peopled with great bearded weeds that stood mutely watching and guarding the seldom opened gate. Then came more lofty grandmotherly elms, a dense hedge of every leaf that pricks, and then Lawford found himself standing at the small canopied gate of the queer old wooden house that the stranger of his talk had in part described. It stood square and high and dark in a small amphitheatre of verdure. Roses here and there sprang from the grass, and a narrow box-edged path led to a small door in a low green-mantled wing, with its one square window above the porch. And while, with vacant mind, Lawford stood waiting, as one stands forebodingly upon the eve of a new experience, he heard as if at a distance the sound of falling water. He still posed on the country roadside, scrutinizing this strange, still, wooden presence. But at last, with an effort, he pushed open the gate, followed the winding path, and pulled the old iron-hanging bell. There came presently a quiet tread, and Herbert himself opened the door which led into a little square wood-panelled hall, hung with queer old prints and obscure portraits in dark frames. "Oh, yes, come in, Mr. Lawford," he drawled. "I was beginning to be afraid you were not coming." Lawford laid hat and walking-stick on an oak bench, and followed his churchyard companion up a slightly inclined corridor and a staircase into a high room, covered far up the yellowish walls with old books on shelves and in cases, between which hung in little black frames mezzotints, etchings, and antiquated maps. A large table stood a few paces from the deep alcove of the window, which was surrounded by a low, faded green seat, and was screened from the sunshine by wooden shutters. And here the tranquil surge of falling water shook incessantly on the air, for the three lower casements stood open to the fading sunset. On a smaller table were spread cups, old earthenware dishes of fruit, and a big bowl of damask roses. "Please sit down. I shan't be a moment. I am not sure that my sister is in, but if so, I will tell her we are ready for tea." Left to himself in this quiet, strange old room, Lawford forgot for a while everything else. He was for the moment so taken up with his surroundings. What seized on his fancy and strangely affected his mind was this incessant changing roar of falling water. "It must be the widder," he said to himself, flowing close to the walls. But not until he had had the boldness to lean head and shoulders out of the nearest window did he fully realize how close indeed the widder was. It came sweeping dark and deep and begreened and full with the early autumnal rains, actually against the lower walls of the house itself, and in the middle suddenly swerved in a black, smooth arch, and tumbled headlong into a great pool, nodding with tall slender water-weeds, and charged in its bubbled blackness here and there with the last crimson of setting sun. To the left of the house, where the waters floated free again, stood vast, still trees above the clustering rushes, and in glimpses between their spreading boughs lay the far-stretching countryside, now dimmed with the first mists of approaching evening. So absorbed he became as he stood leaning over the wooden sill above the falling water, that eye and ear became enslaved by the roar and stillness. And in the faint atmosphere of age that seemed like a veil to hang about the odd, old house and these prodigious branches. He fell into a kind of waking dream. When at last he did draw back into the room, it was perceptibly darker, and a thin, keen shaft of recollection struck across his mind. The recollection of what he was, and of how he came to be there, his reasons for coming, and of that dark, indefinable presence which, like a raven, had begun to build its dwelling in his mind. He sat on, his eyes restlessly wandering, his face leaning on his hands, and in a while the door opened and Herbert turned, carrying an old crimson and green teapot and a dish of hot cakes. "They're all out," he said. "Sister, Sally, and boy, but these were in the oven, so we won't wait. I hope you haven't been very much bored." Lawford dropped his hands from his face and smiled. "I have been looking at the water," he said. "My sister's favorite occupation. She sits for hours and hours, with not even a book for an apology, staring down into the black old roaring pot. It has a sort of hypnotic effect after a time, and you'd be surprised how quickly one gets used to the noise. To me it's even less distracting than sheer silence. You don't know, after all, what on earth sheer silence means, even at Widderstone. But one can just realize a water nymph. They chatter, but, thank heaven, it's not articulate." He handed Lawford a cup with a certain niceness and self-consciousness, lifting his eyebrows slightly as he turned. Lawford found himself listening out of a peculiar stillness of mind to the voice of this suave and rather inscrutable acquaintance. "The curious thing is, do you know," he began rather nervously, "that though I must have passed your gate at least twice in the last few months, I have never noticed it before, never even caught the sound of the water. No, that's the best of it. Nobody ever does. We're just buried alive. We have lived here for years, and scarcely know a soul, not even our own, perhaps. Why on earth should one? Acquaintances, after all, are little else than a bad habit. But then, what about me?" said Lawford. "But that's just it," said Herbert. "I said acquaintances. That's just exactly what I'm going to prove. What very old friends we are. You've no idea. It really is rather queer." He took up his cup and sauntered over to the window. Lawford eyed him vacantly for a moment, and, following rather his own curious thoughts than seeking any light on this somewhat vague explanation, again broke the silence. "It's odd, I suppose, but this house affects me much in the same way as Widderstone does. I'm not particularly fanciful, at least, I used not to be. But sitting here I hope it isn't a very frantic remark. It seems as though, if only my ears would let me, I should hear, well, voices. It's just what you said about the silence. I suppose it's the age of the place. It is very old. Pretty old, I suppose. It's worm-eaten and rat-eaten and tindery enough in all conscience, and the damp doesn't exactly foster it. It's a queer old shanty. There are 2 or 3 accounts of it in some old local stuff I have. And, of course, there's a ghost." "A ghost," echoed Lawford, looking up. End of chapter. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. If you are interested in hearing more audiobooks, Subscribe and turn on the notifications to get fresh daily audiobook chapters from Lambda Audiobooks. Until next time.